Welcome to the Information Security Forum videocast. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert, and today we're featuring ISF Managing Director Steve Durbin in conversation with Colonel Chris Hadfield, a decorated astronaut, engineer, and pilot. In today's conversation, Steve and Colonel Hadfield discuss the importance of constant retraining and self-assessment, preparing to fail, achieving goals despite seemingly impossible odds, and more.
Chris, thanks very much for stopping by. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be an astronaut.
I used to love science fiction. I read all the Arthur C. Clarke and Edgar Rice Burroughs and Isaac Asimov as a kid. And then I watched Star Trek, which was, it was a Western, but it was in space. And movies, 2001: A Space Odyssey, fascinated me. I was, 7 or 8? But then people were actually flying in space at the same time. There was this fantasy world, but then the reality of people flying on Mercury and Gemini and the Soviets with Gagarin and Leonov. And then they walked on the moon when I was 9 years old. And that really sort of clinched it for me. If fantasy science fiction can actually become a reality, and that's a job possibility, that's what I want to do. So I decided to be an astronaut when I was 9 years old,
wow.
and then pursued it for the rest of my life.
But the route to being an astronaut, I think I heard you'd been a test pilot first, and so you'd been managing that career path, I think, for quite some while.
There was no traditional Canadian route to be an astronaut. In fact, when I decided to be an astronaut, it wasn't like hard or improbable. It was impossible by definition. The Canadians were not astronauts.
Right.
But I figured, hey, it used to be impossible for Yuri Gagarin and for Neil Armstrong, so things are going to change. But there was no clear map to get from A to Z. But I thought, well, I'll do similar to what they've done. I'll go to university, I'll study something technical. I chose mechanical engineering. I ended up going to 4 different universities. And you fly a spaceship, so I thought I should probably fly. And so I joined the Air Cadets. They taught me to fly gliders and then powered airplanes, joined the Air Force, as you say. I went through and flew fighters. I was a F-18 pilot during the Cold War, intercepting Soviet bombers. And then I went to test pilot school. Canada doesn't have one, so I went on exchange with the U.S. Air Force. And then I did a tour, oddly enough, as a Canadian with the United States Navy as a test pilot. And then after all that, Canada said, hey, we would like to hire astronauts with our brand new Canadian Space Agency. And because of the things I've been doing since I was 9 years old, out of the many thousands of people that applied, they picked me to be a brand new baby astronaut in the summer of '92. And then I served 21 years as an astronaut based in America at the Johnson Space Center in Houston and in Russia at the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City, just outside Moscow. Flew in space 3 times, and it was better than that little 9-year-old boy dreamed it would be. An amazing experience.
Test pilot, astronaut, those, I think for a lot of people who are perhaps watching this, listening to this, they're dreams. People could never imagine doing that themselves. And I think for a lot of other people, they probably wouldn't want to. It all sounds very dangerous. It's all about, the management of risk, of really stepping into the unknown. How did you deal with that?
Well, part of it is just getting over yourself in the beginning and thinking, okay, this seems like an impossible goal. The way that I made it palatable was I would try and choose somebody who had already done that thing, who I didn't have much respect for. I thought, well, if that person, like say you want to get into politics, choose a politician that you think, really, that buffoon made it? Well, surely then I could be a politician or whatever, a teacher or an engineer or even an astronaut. Not all astronauts are perfect. So through each one of those courses, just to try and give myself a little step up on confidence, I would try and recognize you don't have to be Superman to do this job. Other people have done it before. And what they did was they changed who they were. They recognized there were risks involved. They decided those risks were worthwhile. And then they changed who they were to be able to overcome those risks. And I did it at an infant stage. I learned to walk. When I was learning to walk, I fell and broke my skull. I cracked my skull above my ear. I had a big head and a little kid. but it was important to walk. And riding a bicycle and flying airplanes and then being a fighter pilot, being a test pilot, to me, they're all just slightly more complex bicycles. And the real question is, what do you want to do?
Right.
And some people say, well, I wouldn't want to risk my life. We're all going to die, every single one of us. So to me, the fundamental question is, what do you do while you're alive? And what risks are worth taking that give you a sense both of fun, but also satisfaction in having turned yourself into somebody that is interesting to you, or that you're proud of. And I've just been doing that my entire life. Keep setting distant goals of things that I don't know how to do yet, and then finding ways to change who I am so that then I can go do stuff that at the outset seemed unattainable.
Change is a theme you've mentioned a few times there. 21 years you mentioned having been in the business, if I could put it that way. Again, I think for a lot of security professionals today, some of them will have been in security for a similar amount of time.
Right.
They will have seen a huge amount of change. And I think one of the big challenges that they tell me about is how to cope with that change,
right.
How to anticipate some of those changes, how to adapt. Tell us a little bit about any tips that you've got for them in those sorts of areas based on your experience.
I think we've had two huge changes, societal changes that have affected the pace of what you're talking about. Number one is our ability to communicate with each other. I mean, everyone's got a cell phone and internet and email and all the other ways of exchanging ideas.
Right.
And that increases our speed of invention. And then also transportation. It used to be hard to cross the Atlantic. Now you just think about, oh, geez, no real food, or I've seen all these movies. That's the only real concern you have. There's almost no safety concern at all. Right. To go all the way around the world. In fact, when an airliner crashes, we're all shocked as if somehow this was a guarantee. And that mixture of an improvement of transportation and communication is continuing to accelerate the pace of invention. I think it's important, especially as an IT security professional, that things are never going to be this slow again. And so how can you keep up? The traditional historical educational models are becoming less and less valid. You can't just study as a teenager and in your early 20s, gain some sort of qualification, and have reached then a level of competence that you are now going to be able to ride for the rest of your life.
Right.
Things are changing too quickly. You have to plan to constantly be re-educating yourself. Sort of our traditional bachelor's, maybe even master's plan, it's becoming sort of irrelevant because of the pace of change. So we need to be lifelong students. I think you also have to recognize that your own skill set is fluid. Even if you're superb at something, either you are going to become rustier at it, or the thing is going to change. The regulatory environment, or the enabling technology, or the actual software that you're working with itself. And so you have to be relentless in your dissatisfaction with your own levels of competence. If you're trying to ride the inertia of what you've done so far, it'll only take you for a little while, and then you will be surpassed. You're a runner who isn't continuing to accelerate. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's enabled a quality of life around the world that we have never been able to experience before.
Right.
But there are enormous problems to solve, and it's going to take that increased pace of work, no matter what field you're in. We need all of them in order to address the current difficulties of worldwide high-quality living and civilized life. So it's an interesting time in history. I don't think there's ever been an easier, better one. But that doesn't mean we don't have to work hard. And starting with ourselves. Always continuously looking to train and adapt who we are to be able to grow personally, but also contribute to the growth commercially and internationally.
Right. I think one of the other parallels, if you like, that I'd like to explore with you again is, if I look at most security teams today, they tend to be relatively small, even in large organizations, half a dozen people. Very often they are trying to plan for the day they hope never comes, when something goes wrong.
Right.
And they do that through running exercises and so on. You were the commander of the International Space Station.
Right.
You had a team, I think, of about a similar number.
Yes.
There must have been situations that arose while you were up in space that, yes, you perhaps had planned for, but weren't quite in that in that sort of sweet spot where you were comfortable dealing with them. That's the situation that most security people find themselves in. Any advice for them in that scenario?
Yeah, to be able to successfully fly a spaceship, it is primarily a life of visualizing things going wrong.
Right.
Visualizing failure. You don't launch a rocket ship with your fingers crossed, right? If you were riding on an airliner next time and they left the door open to the cockpit, and just as the airplane was taking the runway, if you looked up to the cockpit and they were going like this and rubbing rosary beads and crying, you would not have any great confidence that the right people are operating the machine.
Right.
And so those pilots have changed who they are, even though they're about to do something quite dangerous, so that they can do it with confidence and competence, and everyone counts on them. On a spaceship, it's just an extremely complicated airplane. And so it takes it to an entirely new level. But it requires a persistence of professionalism, of recognizing that even if I'm great at this, there's still ways for failure to happen, for it to rear its ugly head. That is not exactly what we practice for. You have to build an ever-increasing base of readiness to deal with things going wrong, readiness for failure. And that's what astronauts do for a living, is visualize failure and then choose the highest probability one. Right. And let's get good at that one. And initially, we're probably going to be bad at it. So let's understand the failure, understand the technology behind it, and then let's try and deal with it once. And you realize, oh man, we're not the right group of people. We need to change who we are. We need to get better at this. And then in the time that's available, work that problem until you know how to deal with it. Like, I don't know, having a heart attack or having you can choose whatever you want, a leak in the spaceship, or as happened on my second flight, we were docked with the space station and the hard drives in the main command and control computers for the entire space station started overwriting themselves. Okay. And the entire brains of the spaceship went stupid. And we were suddenly, the lights going off, no longer controlling the environmental system, and the spaceship tumbling through space. What do you do next? Did you somehow, you lose communications with Earth. Did you have the resident skills within your small group of people to be able to deal with the 100 or 1,000 most probable failures? Did you practice while there was time in advance so that when this thing happens, you can go, it's not exactly what we expected. It's definitely not what we wanted. But within our group of people, we have not the specific skill, but the generic skill to deal with something like this. And what we ended up doing was sort of going into the basic primitive brain capability of the space station, rebooting it with this going in and replacing the hard drives with some spares on board. So doing, sort of physical lobotomies, and then having this basic software called Mighty Mouse that could manually get in and get the station pointed the right way so we could start communicating with Earth, and then bringing all the systems back online so the station could function again. It wasn't going to happen automatically. The only way was for the crew to have understood their systems well enough that they know what the failures could look like, working with a team of trainers to develop the skills, practicing them endlessly, never being satisfied with our skill at anything, right up until the moment of execution, and then dealing with whatever comes down the road. And that happened on all 3 of my space flights, some life-threatening problems, but we managed to prevail over them all because of that pattern of visualization, self-improvement, practice, simulation, repeat, and then go execute.
And I'm assuming that in the environment you're talking about, NASA, for instance, is basing some of the training, some of the way in which astronauts need to react on the fact that things will go wrong, right?
Sure.
That's the assumption. I think one of the challenges that security professionals face is that the board of the organization is planning on quite the opposite. The assumption is that things will not go wrong. And if things do go wrong, it's somebody's fault. Now, it just strikes me listening to you that is completely the opposite in your environment. So my question really is, how do we get organizations to adopt a more NASA-like, astronaut-like view on security? So accepting the fact that we are not perfect, that technology is moving at such a speed that people will use it in a way that perhaps they shouldn't use it, and things will go wrong, and to see that as a much more positive, if you like, learning experience rather than negative.
I think a practical way to do that is what pilots, and especially test pilots and astronauts, do. And that is not only to have the training period and selection and then execution as part of your normal function, but also the debrief part, and a non-attributable debrief. So that when you finish something in your simulation, but then also when you execute it in reality, how do we squeeze every little bit of learning out of what we just simulated or what we just did, so that the next time someone executes it, they don't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. Mm-hmm. You have to build a corporate culture that doesn't just attribute blame to an individual, but instead recognizes that people are fallible and every machine will eventually fail. Every bit of software will eventually hang up. I mean, just drive a high-energy proton through the hardware and it'll hang up your software, like happens on the space station all the time. And so knowing that people and machines and code are all fallible, then accept that. Stop looking to just blame someone, but actually look for using that as a positive. Make the learning process ready to accept the inevitability of failure. We call it going wrong. It's not going wrong, it's just going. Mm-hmm. You know, things fail. That's okay. You've made mistakes today. We all do it. Don't pretend something's perfect. And it takes a shift not only of individual culture, but where leadership can demonstrate a shift of culture so that it changes the organization. A great example is in aviation and astronauts, and that is the flight safety reporting. If you make a dumb mistake with an airplane, you could just go, whoa, hope nobody saw that. But recognize that if you just made that mistake, some other pilot's going to make that mistake. Right. And if you don't report back through a flight safety reporting system, then all you're really doing is condemning someone else to repeat your own natural mistake or not learn about a system. The most recent thing with the 737 MAXs, there was a bad corporate culture about how lessons learned were being passed on to other pilots. Right. And ended up going to the very worst of cases, which is twice airplanes exceeded the ability of the pilots because they weren't trained properly, and then it ended up killing not only the pilots, but every single person in the back and losing an airplane. That was all avoidable, but they didn't have the right corporate culture of learning from the mistakes of others. The pilots who had dealt with that had either not been able to get it up through their management, or even if they did within their own company, they didn't transfer over to a company in Indonesia or Africa or somewhere. And we need to learn from that. There was a way to have that flaw in design and not lose the aircraft and all the people on board. And so the culture and the way we communicate it and the lack of blame, but more the overall goal of combined success, those are all things that we do in various industries, and they can be done with security professionals also. But it takes individual change, and then it takes that feeding into a corporate and leadership change that shifts what the norm is.
Fantastic, Chris. It's some great insights there. I think that obviously applicable in your line of business, but also very much so in the security world as well today. So thank you very much indeed for sharing those.
Nice to speak with you. Thanks.
Thank you.
We'll be back soon with another conversation. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe, rate and review it, and we'd love it if you'd share it in your networks. Please visit securityforum.org to join the conversation on our LinkedIn group and download ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance relating to this discussion.